Hi, I'm Paul Germain, your host for Smart Boating. You know, if you watched this show before, you know that we typically focus on informing you about different topics, boating topics, man overboard, anchoring, insuring, a whole variety of topics. But every now and then, we take a trip down a side road to look at some interesting aspects of boating, and that's what we're doing here today. We're at the New Hampshire Boat Museum in Wolfeboro Falls, New Hampshire. And joining us as an expert guide is Sean Berry. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you. Welcome to the New Hampshire Boat Museum. Pleased to have you here, Paul.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sean, you've been involved in boating quite a long time, and there's some interesting aspects of the museum. Can you tell us a little bit about that before we get into the show?
Sure. It was started in 1992 over in the Weirs area on the other side of Lake Winnipesaukee by a group of men who wanted to perpetuate the interest in wooden boats on Lake Winnipesaukee and other lakes in New Hampshire.
Oh, okay.
We kept that museum going until about 2000, and at that point in time we were able to move it over here to Wolfeboro to the facility where we are right now.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting museum because you guys you rotate different brands through or marks through on a regular basis, right?
Yes, we do. We're a small museum and we try to change at least half of the exhibits every year. And of course this year we're kind of focusing on race boats in the Lakes region and in New Hampshire because we had our annual biannual race boat regatta this year.
Right. Well, that's a great topic. So why don't we get right into it and take a look at some of the boats?
Sounds like a good idea. Let's go to it.
All right.
Okay.
Well, Sean, here's one of those very interesting race boats you have here at the museum. This is a Boyd Martin, right?
That's correct. Yeah, Boyd Martin.
And they built those in Indiana?
Yeah, built in Delphi, Indiana. This is a 1928. They built quite a few of them. They probably built maybe 4,000 to 5,000 boats. They were raced nationwide. Very popular boat, very successful race boat.
Wow. Okay. And they won one of the famous trophies was this General Dawes Trophy, I guess,
General
in
Dawes
1929.
Trophy.
Right?
They were famous for that. That was one of the big trophies back then. Did very well there. They're an excellent boat. They had a good reputation,
and it's a mahogany hull with a canvas topside?
That's correct. Most all of these boats had a canvas front deck or topside to reduce the weight primarily.
Okay.
And this boat is interesting because it's all original. Has the original, hasn't had any boards planks replaced on it, has not had the canvas replaced. This is actually canvas that is stretched over the stringers where the deck is.
From 1928?
From 1928. We're fortunate this is on loan from a good friend of the museum. It doesn't belong to us. It's on a sign of a semi-permanent loan to us.
It is. Okay. Now this is a single step hydroplane, right?
That's correct. Has one step halfway down.
Yep. It's right behind the numbers back here. I think we can bring the camera in and show that. And it looks like it's got some fins or something coming out the side.
Yeah, it does have these on the side. This is unusual, but it was something that Boyd Martin came up with, and it was an option on this particular boat. This model was called the Bullet Senior, and you could get these on the side, and in theory it would help the boat when it was cornering on an oval course, and it also would help the boat to plane off faster from a standing start, because the engines on these were quite heavy for the size of the boat.
Right. Yeah. So it was a feature worth trying.
That's correct. Not sure it worked that well.
Right. Well, Sean, looking inside this Boyd Martin, I see a steering wheel. Now, was this typical? A boat like this would have a steering wheel back then?
Well, this did. It was an option that you could have with this boat. Boyd Martin put them in. Quite a few of the boats that raced in this era ran with tiller steering. In other words, you reach back behind you to a tiller and you steered it that way.
Right.
This boat, although it was unusual for 1928, did have a steering wheel, and it also had a throttle control on the steering wheel, which was a little different also.
And I noticed the cable is actually rope.
It's rope, and it has wire inside of it.
Oh, it
so
does?
it's and they typically use that even right up through the early 50s.
Oh, okay. All right. Now, and interesting, this guy Boyd Martin, he was always experimenting with things, and I read a little bit about he used this thing called Venturis to help the boat go faster. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, I'll explain a little bit. You can see if you can pan down on these a little bit. We have these 6 Venturis that are across, and what they do is, as you remember, this is a single step hydroplane.
Right.
And what they do in theory is bring air through the Venturi and bring the air underneath the rear of the boat behind the step.
Okay.
And what this does, again in theory, and it raises the boat the back of the boat up so it reduces friction as we go through the water.
Right.
This particular, although you don't see these exactly the same way, the idea of it has been carried on in boats of today even.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yep.
Now, these guys, even though it's a steering wheel, that you think steering wheel is sitting down,
Yeah.
people didn't sit in this type of boat, did they? They kneeled on a pad, right?
They always kneeled, and the interesting thing about this boat, when you bought it new, you got the kneeling pad with it.
Oh, you did?
And this kneeling pad is in the boat. Looks kind of sad, but it is the original kneeling pad that came with the boat in 1928.
Right. So they would kneel right there, and then they'd go on a race, and that race might be what? It may be around a mile length course or something?
Yeah,
or?
it might be a half mile or a
Half
mile course, primarily an oval course. They would run several heats, and then they would come in, and the boats that went the fastest would be in a final race, which might be longer than that, perhaps 20 laps, something like that.
I see. And a boat of this type would go maybe 30 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour?
Yeah, it would depend on the class it was in, because they had several classes in the A, B, C, D, etc. And the larger class motors, which would be up in the 40, 50 horsepower, would go faster. Some would approach 50, 55 miles an hour. This boat probably ran in a race maybe 35 miles an hour, having a class A motor on it, or a class B.
One of the smaller motors.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Sean, this motor that you're standing next to, or engine really, is typical of one of the older racing motors. Can you kind of walk us through it and tell us some of the unique features of it?
Sure. This is an Elto Speedster made specifically for racing. Elto is the name, stands for Evinrude Light Twin Outboard. And it was one of the companies that Ole Evinrude formed over the years. There's different incarnations of that company. This motor has a very streamlined lower unit, racing propeller, and typical of the era, the two-cylinder engine was a two-cylinder opposed motor. As you can see right here. They operated back and forth this way. In order to start the motor, you have the flywheel on the top, and you typically think of winding a rope around the flywheel to start it. Well, this one is a little different because of a little handle that you pull up. You pull the handle up, and if it's tuned right, you give it about one spin, and it's off and running.
Really? Yeah.
The interesting, and again, as we spoke before, this one typically would have, if you were running it without a steering wheel, this is the tiller, how you would steer it during a race.
Yeah.
The museum is fortunate having this motor here because it has the original box that it came in with it from 1928. We typically would display it on the Boyd Martin, but because we have the box, we like to display it this way so people can see it, and they can actually get up a little closer to the motor and see the features of it.
That makes sense. Now, you told us how you'd steer it. How would you adjust the throttle on it?
How would you adjust? Oh, the throttle's right here. Yep.
Because I know some of the motors that came out in the 60s, they had the tiller and the throttle integral into one handle, but they were separate on a motor.
Not this way. No, you had your fuel here, and then you had a handle right here that you can see. And that would advance the spark. And you would set your fuel carburetor high and then advance the spark this way. So you had to have both hands working, but primarily when you raced it, you got the thing going wide open, and then you just steer it and hope for the best.
Well, Sean, this is an interesting boat. A Century Cyclone, and what's interesting to me is that this is actually a precursor to many of the Centuries that people think about from the 1950s and 60s, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Typically when you think of a Century, you think of a boat that was built in the 30s, in the 50s rather, 50s and 60s, and competed with Chris-Craft, the hot boats, the race orders, little runabouts and things. But you have to realize the Century was in business in the 1930s, and they made a lot of different boats, but they made quite a few of these hydroplanes.
A lot of racing boats, and my understanding is that there was the one called the Kid at first. It was kind of a recreational race boat, and then they came out with the Cyclone, which was more directed towards racing. Lower cost, only a couple $100.
That's
and stripped down just for racing, right?
That's correct, yeah. And they made them in different sizes, depending on the class that the boat was racing in, A, B, or C.
And that, again, it was the size of the engine, right?
That depended on the size of the engine. And the classes were dependent on the cubic inches of the engine. So, for instance, if the engine had a cubic inch displacement of 7.5 inches to 15 inches, it was a Class A. 15 inches to 20 was a Class B. 20 to 30 was a Class C, and of course we have this replicated here as probably a Class D because it has the 4-cylinder large Evinrude Speedy 4.
Well, Sean, as we look at this Century Cyclone, we see the steering wheel, of course, and then this has got an interesting throttle. You don't see that type of throttle on a traditional recreational boat, right?
No, you don't. It's primarily made for racing, and you see it on all these vintage hydroplanes. It's called a dead man throttle, and if you can see, you keep your right hand on the steering wheel, you keep your left hand on the throttle, and when you squeeze it like this and push the button down, this will hold it at high speed.
Okay.
If you get in trouble, you just hit the back of it, and it kills the throttle.
And that's it, yeah.
And if you have it set back enough, it would also kill the engine. In other words, it would bring it right down to below idle speed.
All right. And this has the cable steering, maybe a reflection of the fact that it's a replica. And
Yeah, it would probably have had that rope type steering with a cable inside. Some of the other boats have, but this is set up like this. This is typical of the 1930s. As they got into the 30s, they were using steering wheels more than the tiller steering.
Yeah, yeah. As we come back to here to the engine, it says 460. What did that stand for?
Well, it's a 4-cylinder.
Okay.
And that's the thing, and it's probably the cubic inches. This is a large motor. We have it on display here. It's probably late 40s. It's a little later design than what would have been on this boat originally.
What's the brand of it?
The brand is an Evinrude.
It's an Evinrude.
It's an Evinrude 460. And as you can see, it is a 4-cylinder opposed. You have 2 cylinders on this side, 2 cylinders on this side.
Yeah.
Here's your carburetor. This is your spark advance. And then up here is your flywheel, and this type, you wind a rope around it and give it a crank to start it.
Right.
And of course, these motors did not have a transmission or anything in the lower unit. Once you started it, you were off and running.
You're off and going, yeah. And that's the fuel supply at the top there, the big orange tank?
This is a gas tank, yeah.
Yep.
This was all the fuel was here. Of course, nowadays you have remote fuel tanks, etc. Most all of these older motors all had fuel tanks were made on the boat itself.
Well, Sean, here's an interesting race boat in the museum. It's called a pigeon race boat. About how many feet long is this?
Well, it's 13 feet long, and actually it's called a 3-star model made by the Pigeon Manufacturing Company.
Okay.
That's what it's called.
Okay.
The Pigeon boat was made in Boston, Massachusetts.
Really?
And Duxbury. It was made by the Pigeon Hollow Spar Company, who made flagpoles and hollow spars.
Okay.
They branched out into boats in the mid to late 20s and made several of these. We're fortunate to have this one on display.
This is a very interesting boat. A lapstrake hull.
Lapstrake hull.
You don't see that too much.
Lapstrake you don't in the old days. Lapstrake hull, no step, just straight hull.
And if we look at the hull, it looks like it's got some, I don't know if you call that tumble home, but towards the stern,
it does.
The
has a tumble home.
Got an interesting angle back there.
Yeah, it's quite narrow and quite long. Very fast boat.
Is it
Handles
fast?
well and will corner well, although when you corner with it, it rolls right up on its edge. But there's no fear of flipping it over, so
Not going to go over, yeah, yeah. What do you suppose the beam on is? Maybe 3.5, 4 feet?
Probably
maybe?
3.5 to 4 feet,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And it would be made of, I don't know, plywood maybe? Plywood?
No,
lap
it's probably mahogany or perhaps cedar.
Oh yeah, right, okay. And this boat is original, isn't it?
This boat is all original. The deck has been replaced at one point in time with plywood, but this boat has a very interesting history. Spent its life here on Lake Wentworth. The owner of the boat had a dealership where he sold Alto outboard motors, and he sold 3-star boats made by Pigeon Manufacturing Company. And in 1928, he entered the boat in the Winnipesaukee Marathon, and he won the race and became quite famous because of it. It was a race primarily for large inboards. It was one of the first large long races on Lake Winnipesaukee, which included outboard motors. And he had a terrific time. The water was very rough. He was one of the few boats that finished, and so it has a great racing history. The boat is used by his family for many years. They water skied with it. They used it as a recreational boat. And when he passed away, he left it to his stepson, and then later on, his stepson's family gave it to the New Hampshire Boat Museum.
Wow.
So we're really pleased to have it. It has a lot of great local history.
Yes. Well, Sean, this boat here is, as you were saying, very original. If we pan from the forward section back, when it raced, it wouldn't have had the front seat in it, right?
That's correct. When he raced it and won, he didn't have the front seat, and he would have kneeled down in the back and handled the boat with a tiller steering also.
Okay, as opposed to the steering wheel.
Right.
Now, these boats, something as original as this, it gets a little bit of repair along the way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So is there evidence inside of
Well,
this that it got...
Certainly is. This boat, they kept repairing it. They never replaced much of anything, but as you
Okay.
can see, if you pan in there,
Yeah.
there's quite a few small stove bolts, so to speak, holding some of the strakes together. This is a lap strake, and of course it was put together primarily with nails.
Yes.
And then as things opened up, because this boat took quite a beating when it was racing, why they would put patches in and bolt it together with stove bolts. They also reinforced the keel, which broke, and reinforced that with what looks like a piece of a 2x4. But it was patched up, and of course they continue to use this as a recreational boat for the family. And I saw the boat running as late as 1993.
So they get a lot of enjoyment of it.
Absolutely.
Now, we've got what appears to be an old Johnson on the back here. What would it have raced with?
It raced
Sean?
with, when he won the race, it ran an Alto Quad, and he
Alto
was
Quad.
a dealer. Elbridge Roby, who owned the boat, raced it, and owned the dealership, had the Alto dealership over there, distributorship.
Oh, okay.
And he ran an Alto Quad, which was a 4-cylinder opposed motor, and that was what was on the boat at the time. He continued to use that periodically, and then as they got on in later years and they used it more as a family recreational boat, they used the 25-horse Johnson, which they purchased brand new here in Wolfboro from Winnipesaukee Motorcraft, and that's what's on the boat right now.
Well, Sean, this is just a really interesting boat. You know, people get involved in boating in a lot of different ways. One is they buy a boat from a manufacturer. Other people actually build their boats, and this one was actually built by an amateur, if you will, right?
That's correct, yes. Yeah. Yes, of course you hear about people building boats from kits, but this was not a kit boat.
Oh,
this was built directly from plans.
Okay.
It's an 8-foot Minimax, and the plans came out of popular science, like to say, or science and mechanics.
Science and mechanics, okay.
Actually, we say popular science, but it came out of Science and Mechanics.
Science and Mechanics, right?
Right.
So I think you've got the plans just to the right of you here, and so someone could, I don't know, send $20 or $25 away, and back in the mail would come these plans, I guess, right?
That's correct. It was primarily made out of 2 8-foot sheets of plywood, which you can see here. This is looking down from the top. This is looking at the bottom. You got the sheets of plywood, you put it together. This one was put together by a friend of mine that I know, and he's a very good carpenter and quite skilled. There were hundreds of these made throughout the country. Some of them were pretty crude, but they all just flew, and they put all kinds of crazy motors on them and everything. And of course, some of these ended up being raced in organized races.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. So this is basically 2 8-foot sheets of plywood.
Yes, it is.
Fundamentally, right?
Fundamentally, that's what it is, the deck and the bottom. It does not have a step in it. It's straight on the bottom. And of course, this particular boat, we have Mercury 10 horsepower Hurricane on it, which would have been typical of the area as a racing motor.
Oh, it would have.
And we put period correct throttle, period correct steering wheel, and speedometer on the boat.
Okay, right. Yep. And so this, the engine back there, that you say that would have been typical, 10 horsepower and Mercury, and was there anything about it that made it like a racing engine? As opposed to
Mercury was famous for racing motors, and their motors, although they advertised the Hurricane as a 10 horsepower motor, it probably developed 18 to 20 horsepower and typically ran by the Johnsons and Evinrudes of the era like they were standing still.
Well, Sean, this is a different type of race boat we're looking at here. This is a multi-step or 3-point hydroplane, right?
That's correct. Yes, it's a 3-point hydroplane. Has rides on the 2 sponsons, one on each side here, and probably the prop would be the 3rd
That's
point.
right.
So that's why they call them a 3-point. Also known as, they call them prop riders too, because these things fly. They really get airborne, and quite often the only thing in the water is the prop and a skeg in the middle of the boat to keep it straight.
Right, and the way this is designed is those 2 pontoons, I guess, funnel air underneath the boat to lift the boat?
They do, yes. That's the idea, and the air comes all the way back, keeps it up in the air, so it rides on these sponsons right here, right on the bottom.
And this was a 266 class, if I remember.
266 class, 1961 Coalcock. It was built by Coalcock, and it was raced in that class. And then later on, they increased the piston displacement, so it would have raced with a little bit larger engine.
Okay.
This one, however, has been restored as original, but it does have a 302 Chevrolet in it with Hillborn fuel injection.
So Sean, the race boat's the essence of a race boat is the engine, and here's the 302 we were just talking about. And this had an unusual fuel injection for the time, right?
Yes, it does. It has a Hillborn fuel injection and has a high-performance ignition system. Runs on a real high-octane special racing fuel.
Oh, it does?
They run it on, yes.
Okay, almost like aviation fuel?
Well, it isn't aviation fuel, but it's up in that range.
Okay.
It's a high-octane gas, which is specially bought for these race boats, or this type of engine.
Well, Sean, this is a really interesting boat here. 1929 Gold Cup hydroplane, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Famous designer, right?
Yes, it was. John Hacker designed the boat. John Hacker designed the boat for Samuel Dunsford. Samuel Dunsford was a Concord industrialist who had a large, beautiful summer home in Tuftonboro, and he was quite well known for his activity in Gold Cup and other race boats. He was a real race boat aficionado. He and Hacker together, they designed this boat. In 1928, it was actually built 28 and 29 and delivered via rail to Laconia, floated over to Tuftonboro, where the boat was put in the water and run at that time.
Oh, interesting. Now, you know, the boat is unusual from a number of different perspectives. One, of course, is the top sides. It's got a curved top side. It's not 90 degrees like you see many boats. And what strikes me as well is the shape of the hull underneath is a fairly complex shape, bending of the hull planks. And this is part of what they did back there to see if they could find some more speed, right?
That's right, and you'll notice it has several steps on the bottom. It has made with 3 steps, supposedly to make it go faster and handle better. And it went through several different modifications, but they never could really get this boat to perform the way Sam Dunsford hoped it would.
Oh, really?
So he ran it for a couple years, and in the 30s, he ended up taking out of the water, building another boat, and it sat there for a number of years in his barn.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it really stood the test of time pretty well. It didn't look like it got damaged too badly for all that time sitting.
And it's all original. It's never had any planks replaced on it. Of course, it has been painted, varnished, and taken good care of. But it's an original boat from 1929, which is quite unusual, and it's kind of the pride of our exhibits here this summer.
Oh, absolutely. Double plank bottom?
Double plank bottom, single planked on the top.
And all mahogany, is it?
All mahogany.
Wow.
That's correct.
Well, Sean, we're looking into the engine compartment of this Gold Cup. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I certainly can. This is a 625 cubic inch Packard Gold Cup engine. This particular type engine was the one that Dunsford was able to purchase and put in the boat when he first had it built. After he ran it for a number of years, the boat was, of course, put away and sold. He wasn't too impressed with it. He built a different boat. So several owners later, the motor was removed and sold, and they replaced it with an Oldsmobile 455 V8, which didn't perform too well. Used it a few summers, and the boat was again put away in storage.
Oh, yeah.
Fortunately, a number of years ago, probably 12 years ago, a local gentleman, Mark Howard, was able to purchase the boat, and he located the exact same type of engine that was in here when it was run in 1929 and 1930. Gold Cup engine, 625 cubic inches. You can see it's a 6-cylinder. It's a V-drive. In other words, the engine sits in here backwards. There's the V-drive mechanism sits up forward, and then the prop shaft runs under the engine all the way to the back.
Oh, yeah. And that's for weight distribution, is it?
Probably weight distribution, and again, it was just trying different things to see if he could win the Gold Cup.
Right.
Different modifications that he came up with. Kind of most of the things in that era were trial and error, so to speak, as far as hull design, engines, weight distribution, etc.
Sean, as we look into the cockpit, there's a lot of instrumentation here, which is necessary certainly in a race boat. How much of it is original, do you suppose?
Well, I would say the center cluster, which says Hackercraft right on it, was original to the boat. Some of the other items were probably added later. For instance, this Liberty left and right magneto switch is probably not original to the boat, although it is period correct.
Okay.
You see some other gauges in here that were added later on as they got this, put this motor back in and modified it to run. This boat actually ran in Detroit probably 8 years ago, and it ran in the second and third Wolfboro regattas that we had here. True to its form, it doesn't handle very well and it porpoises. But, and also it might be noted that usually you'd have two people driving this. You have a riding mechanic who handles the shift and probably some of the throttle and engine controls, and your driver who's over here handling the wheel.
Oh, okay. Well, Sean, you know, this Gold Cup racer had a lot of unique features. One of them is the stern shape, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's probably aerodynamics more than anything else. That was what it's made for. And you'll also notice under the stern, it has a huge rudder and a large four-bladed prop.
Right.
That rudder probably has been changed 10 or 12 times over the course of its lifetime to try to adapt it to turning and handling a little better.
Oh, really?
This is probably the best they could come up with now, and that was done in recent years, this large rudder, to make it, try to make it handle a little better and be a little safer.
Well, Sean, it's about time to wrap up the show today, and I've had a great time visiting the New Hampshire Museum here, and you know, with the focus on the race boats, that's been your theme this year, and we got a chance to look at some really rare and unusual boats, some in original shape, and different types of motors, and just got a view into a different part of the boating world, and really appreciate that help with that. Is there anything you'd like to add to the show before we close it out today?
Well, I'd like just to tell you viewers to come and visit us and think about joining New Hampshire Boat Museum. We change our exhibits every year. Next year, we're not sure what we're going to have yet. I know we're going to have some exciting exhibits. Some of the race boats may still be here, some may not. But most of all, we'd like to have you come and visit us. And if you can't, please join the museum. You can access on the website at nhbm.org, and you can Google New Hampshire Boat Museum and it'll come right up, and you'll be able to access all the many features that we have.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Sean, thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Smart Boating viewers, for joining us today. If you had comments or questions, please visit us on our website, www.smartboatingus.com. And we hope to see you back again soon.